First of all, it's a pleasure to be back with you. I am, of course, a member of this congregation, but there are many, many Sundays when I'm not in Bangkok and have visited in other congregations as I have volunteers working throughout the country. It's also a pleasure to see us back in worship. I know we were not in worship for a long, long time. So again, it's a joy to be here. Our first scripture reading today is taken from the book of Isaiah, chapter 43, verses 18 and 19. I'm going to ask you to read it with me. Are you ready? Here we go. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. Oh! It helps if you read the same version of the Bible, doesn't it? Okay, so I'm going to turn around and read what you're reading. Here we go. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. I'm going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you have seen something new this year. Haven't we all? Our second scripture reading is taken from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 to 52, and I might have to do this again. Yeah, here we go. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stood still and said, Call him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up, he's calling you. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, What do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, My teacher, let me see again. Jesus said to him, Go, your faith has made you well. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. I run a volunteer program in Thailand. We invite volunteers to come and serve. And when my new volunteers come to Thailand in ministry with our Thai colleagues at the Church of Christ in Thailand, I introduce them to those verses from Isaiah. Isaiah 43, 18 and 19. Forget the former things, don't dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing, now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Why do I believe that these verses are so important that I need to share them with the volunteers as soon as they land in this country? Well, it's very simple. I've managed volunteer programs for most of my life, and what I've learned is that when new volunteers begin service, they have a fantasy in their head about what that service looks like. In the case of my ministry here in Thailand, they've seen pictures of Thailand, exotic Thailand with its white sand beaches and its glittering temples. They've heard how wonderful Thai food is, and perhaps they've even tasted Thai food in their home country. They can't wait to ride elephants. They can't wait to walk through palaces. They can't wait to swim in the crystal clear waters off the shores of Phuket. It's difficult for them to contain their excitement at being in Thailand. But what I know is that they will encounter many, many things that they did not expect. For example, the place where they will serve is miles from a beach. Secondly, the climate is hot and humid. It's much hotter and much more humid than they ever expected. The food is delicious. delicious, but it is far, far spicier than they thought it would be, even if they tasted spicy food in their own country. They will have no means of personal transportation. They will have no opportunities to explore their new context outside of what their host offers to them, and usually that's not much. And finally, most Thai people will not communicate with them in English, even though they've been studying English all their lives. And they are not able to speak Thai. So what happens? Within a few days, within a few weeks at the most, their fantasy has evaporated. They now realize that their time of service in Thailand here will not be fun, it will be hard work. And all of the dreams they dreamed of beaches and palaces and the freedom to explore this wonderful country, it's disappeared into the mist. And now, a year seems like a very, very long time. And suddenly they long for home and family, for friends and for places that are familiar to them. They long for their favorite foods, their favorite television programs, their favorite pastimes, literally anything that is familiar to them. And that is when they need to hear these words from the prophet Isaiah. For God has called my volunteers to Thailand for a purpose. And God has gone before them to this place to prepare the way for them and to reveal to them something new that will be born in Thailand because they are here. Buried in the strangeness of this land, entangled in the challenges of survival here, God is using them to create something new, something different, something magical. If they get caught in the abyss of longing for their former life in their own country, if they succumb to the constant pull of family and friends and all those old familiar things that are now so far away, they will not see what God is doing in their lives and in the lives of those they are serving with here. They must not look back. They must not hold on to those former things. God is not behind them. God is gone before them. And what God is doing is in front of them, not behind them. So this is what God was saying to the children of Israel through the prophet Isaiah in our scripture today. The children of Israel were caught in this wonderful memory of King David and King Solomon, who, by the way, had now been dead for 200 years. But they'd heard the stories of those good old days from their parents. They wanted that great kingdom and the glory of that time to return. And instead, they'd suffered through all these weak kings on the thrones of Israel and Judea. They were constantly under threat from the Assyrians on one side, the Babylonians on the other side. Isaiah reminded them that God was with them and that God was going before them to create a new future for them. Regardless of what that future might hold, God would be there. God would never forsake them. Instead, God would create rivers in what looked like a wasteland to them. And that desert would be filled with wonderful things. And so it came to pass that after Isaiah prophesied to them, the children of Israel faced challenges they could have never predicted when Isaiah spoke those words. King Nebuchadnezzar invaded Israel, destroyed the temple at Jerusalem, carted the people and the wealth of the land off to Babylon. And the Jews were forced to find new ways to worship God and to be a community together in exile, in captivity. It was the prophet Jeremiah who actually was with them in captivity in Babylon. And he too urged them not to look back on the old days and their old lives, but to settle down, to plant gardens, to marry and to have children, and to live in this new place and to seek the welfare of this new place. And it wasn't the last time. For if you remember, they all went back to Israel. They rebuilt the temple only to have it destroyed again, this time by the Romans. And once again, the Romans scattered the Jewish people and the early Christians. And once again, they had to find a new way of being community together and of worshiping God. So, on Easter Sunday this year, shortly after the Thai government issued the emergency decree for COVID-19 and imposed significant restrictions on our way of life here in Thailand, I went out at dawn for my morning exercise. But on that day, I walked more slowly than I usually do. What does Easter mean when you can't go to church to celebrate Christ's resurrection with other Christians? That's never happened to me in my life. I felt the way Mary must have felt on that first Easter morning, searching for meaning in life when all that has given meaning to life has vanished. How could I make sense of the present? How could I put it in context with all that I knew and have known? How could I share a word of comfort, a word of meaning, a word of hope with those who look to me for leadership? That day, I asked God to show me something that would allow me to see this world in a new light. And I almost missed it. I walked right past it. And then I stopped and went back. And I took a photograph of it to share with you. Now, those of you at International Church know how much I love to share little things with you when I come and preach, right? Okay. Well, I did make some, but not enough for everybody. Okay? So you'll have to make your own. I found out they're really not that easy to make, but it can be done. It can be done, okay? So what are they? They're eggs. And I call them my Easter eggs because that's when I found them, right? Easter eggs, but they're not brightly colored like other Easter eggs. They're brown. And there are other differences, like there are no egg yolks, and there are no egg whites, and there are no fluffy little chicks, okay? Instead, they've been filled with dirt and seeds, and now little plants growing, and they're getting quite big so that I can't close the lid anymore. So, I never expected to see like little tiny plants coming out of eggshells. And that's the message of hope I want to share with you today. Okay. Forget the former things, God says. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Today is different. With the COVID-19 pandemic circling the globe, we're living in a time in which you and I need to change the way in which we live. The way we lived in the past no longer works. But you know, we're not the first to have our whole world uprooted or to face major changes in the way in which we live. Indeed, this is not even the first major change to happen in our lifetime. So take a look here. When I was young in Thailand, every Thai farmer had a water buffalo. And nobody had a cell phone. Today, to my knowledge, no Thai farmer has a water buffalo, and everybody's got a cell phone. And it's all happened in our lifetime. Well, in my lifetime anyway. older than some of you. Okay? So what's the difference? Well, most of us view the mechanization of farming and the invention of cell phones as positive changes in our lives. And while those changes happened quickly, they happened over a period of years, not days and weeks. And thirdly, we believe that we had the option to choose those changes. Not to have them forced on us. And yet, you know, if you speak of the good old days with the Thai folks that I know, they will tell you how Thai people used to live in wooden houses up on stilts by streams of cool, clear, running water filled with fish and surrounded by rice fields and coconut palms. They conveniently forget that they did not have indoor plumbing. They conveniently forget they did not have air conditioning. And that the smell of the chickens and the pigs under the house permeated the entire house. COVID-19 is a scary disease. It came upon us very, very quickly. It forced drastic changes in our lives, and this was not something that we chose for ourselves. We don't like it. So we spend much of our time talking about how long it's going to last and when we will finally be able to get back to normal. We talk about the good old days, you know, back in January. And we dream of doing things the way we did them together back in January. You know, on that Easter Sunday morning so long ago, Mary just wanted Jesus to be alive again. To be with her, to talk to her, to laugh with her, to teach her, like he did in the good old days before that awful Friday when he was crucified. But the good old days were gone for her and for all of the disciples. While Jesus did return and show himself to them, things were never the same again. Not for Mary and not for any of the disciples. They had to reimagine what life would be like as followers of Jesus Christ and how to be together as God's children in this world, in this awful world after the crucifixion. Things were not the same. And they would never be the same again, even if Mary and the disciples were the same people that they had been the previous Friday. Those eggshells are still eggshells. But they do not have whites, yolks, or fluffy chicks in them. These eggshells are still eggshells, but you and I never expected to see plants growing out of them. They've been repurposed. The eggshells are still eggshells, but they're being used in a new way. The eggshells are still eggshells, and they still harbor life, but not the same kind of life. They still serve a purpose, but not the same purpose. They are still useful, but in a different way, in a way that we would never expect. That's what I saw on Easter Sunday morning. And that was God's message to me on that day. Bluntly, God said to me, Sharon, why are you so focused on the past, on the way that things have always been? Why are you looking backward toward the life you were leading before? I am doing something new, and I'm doing it right in front of you. Can't you see it? And the answer, frankly, was no, I can't, because I'm looking at eggs and expecting egg whites and egg yolks or fluffy little chicks. And until that moment, I was not able to see that eggs might be doing something different, might be contributing in new ways, and that makes me ask the question, what have I missed seeing in this coronavirus pandemic? Why am I looking backwards, waiting for life to return to what I consider normal? Why can't I see what God is doing that is new and is different right in front of me? And that brings us to our second scripture reading and the story of Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus was a blind beggar seated in the dust on the side of the road as Jesus, in a huge crowd of people, made his way to Jerusalem. Bartimaeus was not a significant person. On the contrary, since the Jews believed that if someone were disabled, it was because God had made them that way due to their past sins. He was a sinner in the eyes of society, and if he was blind, he was suffering his just punishment. He was a nobody. He sat by the side of the road so that he could collect coins from passers-by to feed himself since he wasn't able to work. He heard the crowd coming, and he knew that he had a chance to have some donations thrown his way, but only if he could attract their attention. And they weren't paying any attention to him. They were all focused on Jesus. Bartimaeus had heard about Jesus, and he knew he had a reputation for healing the sick, restoring sight to the blind. But again, Bartimaeus was seated in the dust by the side of the road, and no one was going to see him. Have I changed this yet? Oh, there's Bartimaeus. Okay. He had to get someone's attention. So he called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now the people in the crowd surrounding Jesus were offended that he did this. That he had the temerity to do this dusty beggar. That he would speak at all. They tried to silence him. But Bartimaeus called out even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped in the road. It's such a small action to stop. But Jesus stopped. Now, when Jesus stopped, he communicated very clearly to every person in the crowd that surrounded him, without saying a word, that this dusty beggar mattered. Because Jesus stopped, they all had to stop. Because Jesus paid attention, they all had to pay attention, not just to this dusty beggar, but to what Jesus did after that. This is why what our leaders do matters. When they stop, we stop. What they pay attention to, we pay attention to. When they speak, we listen. What they do, we emulate. They are our leaders. We are their followers. And because we follow, what they do matters. Jesus stopped. And then he said, "Call him here." And they did. Bartimaeus stood up and went to Jesus. And when he was standing in front of Jesus, Jesus asked him, "What is it that you would have me do for you?" And Bartimaeus answered him, "My master, my teacher, restore my sight. Let me see again." That means that at one time in the past, Bartimaeus could see. He had seen before, and he wanted to see again. He believed that Jesus could restore his sight, and Jesus, without touching him, said to him, "Go, your faith has healed you." And Bartimaeus, his sight restored, followed Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. Jesus did not ask Bartimaeus to follow him to Jerusalem, but his sight restored, he could now do so. In this act of mercy by Jesus, not only was Bartimaeus' sight restored, but he himself was transformed from a helpless person trapped in his own tragedy to a restored person on a new path to discipleship, all because he could now see. Now, Jesus didn't have to do this miracle. It was the last one. It was a merciful gesture to a blind beggar, but it really didn't make a difference in the overall Jesus story. Everyone already knew that Jesus could heal people, that he could make blind men see, that poor people were important to him. And Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, where he knew that destiny waited for him. So why did he take the time to heal this man? We don't know. But in doing so, Jesus did two things for us today. Number one, he demonstrated that no one is unimportant, even a blind beggar by the side of the road. Secondly, he turned one more person from a helpless observer to an active participant and faithful follower. My prayer to God on that Easter Sunday morning was, my teacher, let me see again. Restore my sight, that I might see what you would have me see. Let me see what you're doing right in front of me during this pandemic. Draw me into that new vision of a post-COVID world so that I won't look back on the life that I had before, but will follow you forward into a new future. Turn me from a helpless observer in a tragedy to a restored and faithful follower of you. And that's my prayer for all of you today. If you're looking back at the life that you led before COVID came into it, if you're praying that God will restore that former life to you so that you can once again be the person you were, doing the things you did before, I'm asking that God will share with you a new sight for a new vision of what God is doing in front of you. Because you see, God is not behind you. God is going before you into the future and wants you to follow him there. I pray that you and I both will have the courage to open our eyes and see what God would have us see and walk confidently into a totally new world